Hey, it's Warren Huart here. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm sitting with the great Warren Sokol. How are you?
Good, nice.
Great name, by the way.
Yours too. I was really impressed just by that. You know.
Yeah, well, you know.
It's like
So we're here at, I suppose, United Mastering,
United Mastering.
but it's in the main United building.
Yeah. It's
So we have like Studio B here, Studio A over there.
Yep. I have a partner here, Eric Labson, is another engineer that I partner with here. And when we found out that they were looking to put mastering back in here, it just wasn't even a question. The vibe here, though, you know, you have people across the hall actually making music. There's a creative vibe here, and just walking down the halls, you can feel it.
So tell us a little bit about your setup here. Now, what I find interesting is, first of all, we were talking about the acoustic treatment you had to do in here. I think that that's probably something we should get into. Okay, the reason why I want to bring this up is because I've never seen these before. These are, well, tell me about them. These are active
bass traps.
Active bass traps.
They're made by PSI Audio, and it's called the AVAA. And what it is, it works from 15 hertz to 150 hertz, which is kind of rare period for acoustic treatment. It plugs into the wall, and it creates an anti-impedance zone. There's a sound pressure mic in there, and two membranes. One is a resistance and one is an impedance, which is kind of the same thing technically. Right. One is frequency based, but so the microphone feeds a signal to one of them, and creating an impedance in front of a resistance, creating an anti-impedance zone that's about 4.5 feet in diameter.
In the seating environment sitting over there, when you played something earlier, you turn them on and off, there was like this low end floppiness, and then you turned it on and suddenly all the low end got really super tight.
Yeah,
the kick got very defined, the bass got very defined.
One of the places I hear it, like in rock music, is the kick and the bass. With them off, there's a bit of a masking effect where you just kind of hear bass. You know, you can hear them, but you can't hear that kick and the bass distinctly. Turn them on and it removes the mode, the main mode that's in the room.
Right, great. Now, the Lipinskis. These are very beautiful. Did you use these also at Universal?
Yeah, I've been using these for almost 10, 12 years now exclusively. I shouldn't say exclusively, but if someone was to say, what speaker do you want to use, it's going to be these. They're extremely accurate, and a lot of their advertising calls them audio microscopes. They're extremely accurate and defined, but at the same time, I enjoy listening to them. Like, there's some audiophile and extremely accurate speakers that just aren't any fun. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand.
They don't, I don't know, it's technically perfect, but it doesn't sound good to the ear. And sitting there for 12 hours a day working on something, I don't want something that's irritating my brain. You know what I mean?
Right.
Regardless of accuracy, but.
So when did you start?
Started doing mastering exclusively probably about 15 years ago in Phoenix. I was in a band, got into recording, went to recording school, mainly just for us.
Which recording school?
The Recording Workshop in Chillicothe, Ohio.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, there's one out here as well, the Hollywood Recording Workshop. I really did enjoy it a lot, and it definitely influenced, you know, I wasn't looking at getting into mastering back then. I was doing recording and mixing.
I've always wondered how anybody gets into mastering. It's you know what I mean? I don't know. What was that journey? How do you go from band to learning to record to becoming a mastering engineer?
For myself, like I said, I was in a band, and I wanted to know how to record for us. You know what I mean? I wasn't looking at doing a home studio. This was when we were still on tape, and this was over 20 years ago now. So I wanted to know how to work for us, you know, and got into the recording side of it. And so I bought a small recording setup for the home, just for myself, so I could continue making music. And then I had a big home studio at that point where I was servicing bands and not really doing much for myself anymore. And at that point, a lot of people started doing home studios. Pro Tools LE had come out, and cheaper gear had started to come out. So a lot of people were making home studios. So I was like, how can I make mine better? And had the idea to buy a couple of mastering pieces. What I had purchased originally was a Manley Very-Mu, because it was the one compressor I would see in every mastering studio.
So you had the Very-Mu. What was your EQ that you had in your home
Manley
setup?
Massive Passive.
Oh, well.
Which I still have one of those.
So did you start taking on projects from other people to do mastering?
Not at first. First, it was just kind of when I would record and mix something, I would kind of touch it up at the end, not really knowing much about mastering. But it was a learning process at that time, and it was something that I would always do when I get done mixing with something, before I really knew what mastering was at all. And so when I started getting into it and learning the technical parts about it, it was kind of like, oh, this is...
All right, so I'm going to ask you a bit about the gear. But I want to know a basic question before we go into this. How much are you doing software stuff?
Depends on the project,
Depends on
really.
the project?
Yeah. If I got something that's a really great mix and something like classical or jazz or something where the depth and spaciousness of it really counts, I don't want to mess that up if it sounds great. So I have some really high quality digital pieces and some plugins and stuff. And if something's really great and I just need to touch it a little and maybe get the level up, I'll sometimes stay all digital.
Do you have a favorite limiter then that you...
I really like the limiter in the TC 6000, which isn't a plugin, obviously. It's digital, but it's outboard in the TC. They have a great brick wall limiter. It happens to be pulled up. This thing has 4 engines, so I have some things ready to go.
Right.
You know what I mean? The limiter in there is great. As far as software, the PSP Xenon limiter.
PSP Xenon limiter.
Yeah, PSP the AudioWare. They make a bunch of plugins, and they have a couple of mastering plugin, EQ, and a limiter. And that limiter's great. It really is, as far as being able to push level when you need to and not have it the normal artifacting that they do. I also use the Ozone limiter. As of version, I think 6, they rather than all being one big plugin, they have just the limiter, just the EQ.
Great.
Their limiter's good too. It tends to color things a little more than say this or the PSP. So I use that when I want it to kind of put an edge on the sound a little, and that's not a bad thing. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. Over the past year or so, I've really got into using the plug-in limiters more, mainly because of revisions. Sometimes, a revision needs to be EQ'd and stuff, and you have to recall everything.
And then plug-in EQs, is there any?
Once again, the PSP Neon
Interesting.
is a great plug-in EQ. It's both linear phase and regular, and it's, once again, just a great.
Are you reaching for the linear phase? You feel like that's...
I don't use it all that often.
Oh, interesting.
When I'm setting something up, depending on what I'm doing with the EQ, I'll check it and go back and forth pretty much every time, and 99.9% of the time I go with the standard phase. Sometimes with low-pass filters, I'll use the linear phase. It seems to be a bit cleaner or affect the audible band a little less. In most cases, though, I like the minimum phase, like standard EQs more than linear phase. Yeah.
Okay, so the Pendulum. I see this a lot. Are you a big fan?
Yes. This is my tube compressor now.
Right.
My philosophy, and not everybody's like this, but I don't feel I need every piece of gear in the world. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I need something that I know is going to work right every time.
Something you know really well.
Right. Not to jump off of that, but in reference real quick, these are kind of a new compressor from David Hill, who owns Crane Song. He has a new line called Dave Hill Designs, and right now it's just a preamp on this compressor. And they're digitally controlled analog. And it's actually 2 compressors in here, a pulse width modulation like a Massenburg, which is incredibly clean. Like I can crank down 10 dB of gain reduction on this, match the level, and if it's on this pulse width, you can barely tell anything happened depending on the mix. It's unbelievably clean compressor, except for the compression that you're wanting. You know what I mean? It doesn't dull transients or change the frequencies. And then opposite that, it says vintage, but that's a diode compressor, similar to an Abbey Road, which is kind of spongy and purposely distorted, and there's 15 steps between it. So with this guy, and then there's also a couple of other special things here, is dynamic color, that what that knob does is as it's compressing the envelope of the sound, it will expand the transients. So if I have to do a little more compression than I wanted, that's kind of like the bring the life back knob. So anyway, with this guy, I can get pretty much anything I need mastering-wise, except for the sound of tube compression, which is more of a hug. These things sound cleaner and edgier, where tube compression tends to kind of glue things more and round things off. So with those 2 boxes, I can get pretty much anything I need.
Are you doing much multiband compression?
No, I'm not a fan of it. I do it when I need it. And usually I'll be using 1 band, maybe 2.
Is it more of a rescue situation?
Yeah. Like if you got that 1 bass note, everything's great and that 1 bass note sticks out, that's where I'll go reach for a multiband. Or the vocals buried, or when there's a problem is when I use multiband.
I find in mixing, honestly, I don't use multiband at all. Very rarely.
Yeah. Tends to be kind of a...
It's good on bass for the same reason.
That's where I use it most, is the bass. Or, like I said, a vocal.
Here's a question I've never asked a mastering engineer. From a mix point of view, I have an academy, so people mix my tracks all the time. So I get to hear other people interpret it.
It's amazing how much the same exact tracks can be 100% different.
Yeah, absolutely different. But I find certain issues reoccur. For me, it's like in a vocal, I hear like 600, 700. There's like I'm always telling people, pull that out, pull that out, pull that out. As a mastering engineer, you're getting hundreds of thousands of different mixers work. But do you find common mistakes that come up?
Yeah.
And what are those kind of
maybe
common
different
mistakes?
versions of common mistakes? A lot of times, the simple thing, clipping. You know what I mean? Whether you can see red lights or not, the tracks might have been clipped during recording, and you can hear that, and there's no fixing that.
So the first thing that you're noticing is clipping.
Yeah, just clipping or sending something to be mastered that's already been through a limiter because it was on your mix bus the whole time you're mixing. I used to teach for a long time as well when I lived in Phoenix. And I would always try to instill in them that if you have a limiter or a compressor on your master bus while you're mixing, you're not really hearing what the individual things are doing. And I know that some people have the complete opposite opinion of that. But in my experience mixing and getting mixes for mastering, you get a much better result just mixing. And if you're going to master it yourself, doing that stuff after your mix is finished, to me is more beneficial. You're growing in these stages as opposed to here, just throw it all out there and see if we can sweep it into a song. You know what I mean?
You know, I still mix in a hybrid fashion. So I'm going through a console and I have an SSL. So I use the bus compressor, and I'm definitely getting 2, maximum 4, but usually like 2 dBs worth of gain reduction. But the SSL bus compressor has such a sound, it's a 4000, that you take it out and it doesn't sound like your mix anymore. And I do have a pair of mastering Pultecs where I have a little 60 boost and a little 10K boost that's always on.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with
that. I don't
that.
crank it.
That's the thing, is I'll get something somebody sends into mastering that's 6 dB louder than it needs to be when it's finished, because they've had a limiter cranked down to -6 the whole time they're mastering, or -10, and it's making it loud the second they pull up one fader.
So then my second question would be on this same subject. Do you have a preferred level, or is it just...
As long as it's not clipping, I can deal with it.
Okay.
I prefer it to be, you know, loudness, average level, that's gonna depend per song, but clipping, if it's -3, -6, something like that, or the peak level, I should say, not clipping.
It's interesting because we as professionals, and this is something I think that is a good point, always talk about the distance from zero, where I get asked all the time about -18 dB FU SAQ 971, and I'm like, we don't talk like that.
Right.
It's interesting. I think there's a new, because everything is in digital now, everything, you know, DAWs, everything, everybody talks in a way that's a manufacturer-based world.
Right. Well, that's different for every manufacturer in a lot of cases, though, too, you know?
Gets a little confusing because for us, it's like, here's 0. Here's like CD at 0.
You have a ceiling. You have
a ceiling.
Yeah.
So for us, you want 3 or 4 dBs worth of headroom,
right,
so you can master it, and then you're happy. And even if it goes right up to 0, as long as it's not clipping, you can deal with it,
right,
you can work with it.
If I need to, I can bring it down in the DAW before I come out to all this. So as long as it's not clipping, I can work with it. I'd prefer it to come in completely unlimited. Compression, that's the mixer's taste, you know what I mean? Although sometimes that can tie the hands of whether or not I can add like the benefits of this tube sound, because giving it any more compression is going to be too much in a lot of cases.
A lot of mastering guys I've been speaking to, actually just outside of, you know, Produce Like a Pro, just as a mixer, tell me they're increasingly not compressing anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
They're just limiting.
I've never kind of relied only on compression limiting to get loudness. There's some things in the analog world you can kind of play with gain, you know what I mean? Gain staging. And driving this into that, and then making sure that the output level is acceptable, and gain some RMS level through harmonics. And so I tend to use harmonics and gain more than, let's compress it by 5 dB because I need to bring it up. You know what I mean? That you're ruining something in order to do that.
So my next question would be, what EQ problems are you getting continuously? You must be.
Usually in the bass. You know what I mean? 99% of problematic stuff that comes in. Once again, mastering room, speaker system is flat as possible. We have subwoofers, dual subwoofers, and it's calibrated in a way so that we have the flattest signal possible. Usually flat doesn't necessarily sound good, but in a mastering situation, I don't want my speakers coloring what I'm hearing. So if somebody went and mixed their whole hip-hop album on a speaker that big, more than likely there's going to be a problem in the bass, because you can't hear the low sub and subsonic frequencies out of a speaker that big, or you're hearing the harmonics of it and making decisions based on that. And so people bring stuff in. Usually it's stuff with big bass. You know, a song that's meant to have big bass will come in, and either it's through the roof big bass, or one really loud note and the rest is quiet or normal, or there's no bass and it just rolls off. And that's usually the opposite situation, where they've got a subwoofer set up like you would one of those booming 90s cars with this huge bass, and it's just rolling your stomach no matter what. But you go listen to it somewhere else that doesn't have that, and obviously that's not there. So those are the main problems I see in bass.
When I grew up making records and working with people on consoles, they would always really constructively use high passing beautifully. And so what would happen is you get a defined kick, you get an amazing low end on your bass, you get the low end glue from the guitars to the bass. And there's been a little bit of misinformation over the last couple of years, probably due to YouTube, where they're telling people not to high pass anymore. So I get mixes that have this horrible masking effect of low end, where the kick and the bass and the guitars are just this big blob of low end.
Yep. So that's hard to deal with here.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about that, because I've been seeing a lot of misinformation about that, and it's a little scary, because I'm listening to mixes all the time that, oh yeah, but I saw this guy telling me I shouldn't be high passing.
Yep.
I'm like, no, you shouldn't be high passing badly, but you should definitely be high passing.
Yeah, if you have all these different sounds trying to take up that, it just ends up mudding it all together. And that's a hard thing to fix in the mastering side of things. We have some specialized tools. You can go MS. For those that are not familiar with MS, or only familiar with MS being mid-side microphone technique, we can also use that in mastering, where if I have a left-right signal and I put it through an MS processor, left now becomes just the center and right becomes the sides. And then it goes back through another conversion and turns back to left-right. Between mid-side processing and multiband processing and a couple of other pretty surgical tools like that, you can fix a lot of stuff. But when you have just complete frequency masking like that, what I would do to try to make the guitar come out more is going to mess up the bass or the kick. So that's a really hard thing to fix.
Are you getting a lot of that recently?
Yes and no. I think that's something that's always been a problem.
Oh, it has.
You know what I mean? More so than clipping, which kind of came about in the past 10 years with the advent of everybody has a DAW in their bedroom now. You know what I mean? And I've actually had somebody tell me one time, yeah, we got perfect levels. The red lights are on the whole time. Usually it's things like that, digital problems that came about because there's so many tools available and so much misinformation, like you were talking about, or just the not going out and getting that information.
So my general reality is, like, if I got my low end of guitars and I'm maybe about 150, 200, I want my bass to sit around about 80, 100, my kick traditionally at like 40 or 60. So what I've been noticing with a lot of people that have been sending me mixes to critique and stuff is that in this sort of area between like 60 and 200, there's no clarity anymore. Because they're not going in and finding the areas of the guitar. Now I get it, obviously if you had a low A on your guitar, you may want to go below there, but then you're going to have to maybe try some tricks like, either multiband compression or, sidechain compression at least. So maybe when the kick hits, it just sucks out a little bit of energy out of the other instruments, just so if there's some definition. But, all right, so low frequency issues you have to deal with, whether they be hip hop and too much bass, not enough bass, masking in rock and roll, where there's any other sort of things. For me, I was saying earlier, I get a lot of like kind of nasalness in vocals. I try to get people to bring out. What about de-essing as well?
It comes up, and in mastering, there's two different, probably more than that, but there's two different main cases where you need de-essing. There's the vocal, or an instrument that has something really sibilant or harsh in it, and then there's a mix that the whole top end is harsh, and no matter what's going on, you know what I mean? So I have a couple of different tools. I prefer digital de-essers to analog. I don't know if that's true for all mastering engineers, but if I sit here...
I do. De-essing digital now has changed my life.
Yeah, if I think about the other gear that I've seen in other studios, I think that's kind of common now.
Also, I find that if I have issues in a mixing world, I can use 3 de-essers.
I can't necessarily do that, but...
Right, but you know what I mean? On one source where back in the analog-only world, we had a de-esser, maybe 2 if you're lucky.
Right, that's true. Well, the ones that I use are both plug-in de-essers. One is by SPL Audio, and it's very broad. It's a bell shape, and it uses phase cancellation as opposed to dynamic reduction. So it is unbelievably transparent and just does what it's supposed to do. There's no setting a specific frequency because of phase cancellation, it basically only cancels out the offending problem. And they work great when you've got something broad. If I have an S that I need to go and take that band out, it's not useful for that to me. If it's an S with the big gap in the tooth kind of thing, where it's gonna cut your head off every time they say a word with an S, I prefer the PSP, or I'm sorry, it's the Sonox. I think it's called the Suppressor. And it can be used as a full band compressor too, but it allows you to go in and make an extremely tight area, and it's linear phase. I'm not a big fan of linear phase EQ, but linear phase correctional stuff tends to work very transparently. So you can set a super tight bandwidth anywhere in the frequency zone. It doesn't have to be just high. So if I've got a kick drum that tends to bounce out like that, I can use it for that as well. Or a full band compressor. I have better options. Anyway, it's unbelievably surgical and really, really transparent as well for that kind of thing. So those are the two ones I tend to use.
Amazing. Great. Those are great tips. Any other EQ situations that you're finding come up a lot? Genre specific?
It's more mix specific than genre. Although I would say like hip hop tends to have bass problems. If there's going to be a problem, it's generally in the bass, or it's mono. Because I get a lot of, and not just, once again, not just independent stuff. There's an album that just came out, the big time hip hop album, and I would say half or more of it is in mono, or at least the beat is. The beat will be mono, and then you'll have a stereo spread of vocals.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem too, because if everything's down the center, it's all sitting on top of each other, not only frequency-wise, but physically. Mostly it's in the bass. Vocals sometimes will have it. Usually when I see it more when there's a lot of vocal tracks, when they've doubled or tripled or quadrupled the vocal track and haven't necessarily set up one as the main vocal. I'll have vocal problems that interact with the guitar, sit on top of each other the whole time.
What kind of frequency ranges?
Probably like 4K to 600 or 700, maybe a little lower than that depending on the song. High end doesn't seem to be as big of an issue these days, but as far as the mixes that come in, that seems to be a bit more standardized.
I feel like people are not afraid to low pass. They're afraid to high pass.
Yeah.
I think with the listening environment, I'm reaching for a cell phone doing this. I think so many people are listening with earbuds, cell phones, laptops, that they're actually hearing the high end more than anything else. All right, so let's return to the gear. We did a brief thing on the Pendulum. It's your tube compressor.
Tube compressor, solid state input-output amps, as opposed to the Fairchild or Very Mu, which are tube input, tube compression, tube output amp, which obviously colors it a lot more.
But it does color it.
It does, although not that much. Enough to where, like, a Fairchild or Very Mu, I probably couldn't use on a hip-hop song because they just bury the bass. Even with a high-pass filter on the side chain, it still just buries the bass. This doesn't do that. In fact, I think there might be a bit of a high-pass filter built into it naturally because I can put it on hip-hop and actually depending on where I got the attack, it'll give it a bit of a oomph on the transient sometimes of the kick and stuff.
SPL. Talking of SPL.
Yeah, this is a pretty special EQ. Similar to a Pultec in that I have low frequency cut, low frequency boost. So the way this is laid out is odd. There's an output gain. It's only attenuation. I don't have any actual gain. It's an attenuator. I shouldn't call it gain. And then this side is cut and this side is boost. And then we've got a Q for this. So low shelf cut, low shelf boost. I can do them at the same time. Yep. Similar to a Pultec, although the cut isn't a bell. They're both shelves.
Interesting. So what does it do? Because with the Pultec, what we love about that boost and cut is that you can boost the 60 and then you attenuate it and it just kind of does this.
Yeah. It doesn't do that, although the shelves naturally have some of that built in. Like as you increase more gain, it does that bit of a dip on there for the boosting side of it. But it's just shelving. Shelving EQ, let's call it a bass shelf, is when we take whatever frequency, let's say I'm at 95 hertz. As I cut that, it's going to be cutting everything from 95 all the way down to 0. So a shelf, whatever your corner frequency is that you pick on the EQ, it's going to do, on a low shelf, it's going to EQ from that frequency all the way down to the bottom, as low as it goes. A high shelf would do the opposite. Pick the frequency and it's going to boost or cut the high end all the way up as far as the bandwidth of the EQ goes. A bell EQ is one of them that's shaped like that. So you boost it up and it goes like that, and you have bandwidth to make it wider or tighter. The mid bands on this are bells, although they don't give you a Q or a bandwidth control. The high
they're fairly wide?
Yeah, everything on here is really wide. I can't do anything correctional with this.
That's what I was about to say.
It's a tone EQ, and I can't use it on every mix. There's a technique, focusing an EQ is what I call it. Other people have another word for it, where let's say I need to find the vocal frequency. What I would do is boost one of my mid bands up and then start going through the frequencies until I find the one that makes the vocal stick out. And then depending on what I want to do, I would either zero it out and just add enough or dip out enough, finding a frequency, focusing the EQ. Unlike other bell-shaped EQs, when I'm going through the frequency selection on this, it does a weird thing where as I switch to a different frequency, normally the center of the bell will jump to the new center frequency. And on this one, didn't realize this until I saw it on the white noise, but you go through the first couple and it jumps frequencies like normal, and then you hit one and instead of jumping to a completely new frequency, it widens out, creating a new center frequency with a wider bell. And then the next step will widen it a little more, and the next one starts closing it back up, and then it jumps to the next one. So like,
Interesting.
You're going 4.8, 4.5, 4K, 3, and then it widens out to 2.8, and widens out to 2.3, and then tightens back up to 1.8, and tightens up to 1.3, and then completely jumps to 700. So it was just listening to it and not knowing that, I would be focusing it in, and all of a sudden it wasn't, the next step didn't do what it would normally do.
Why do you think they did that? Because there's certain frequencies that, I don't know, musical? They think
Well, it is that.
They're helping you make decisions.
Yeah, and that's the idea behind it, and being a lot of times stepped frequencies on an EQ, analog at least. That's the exact thing, is that each one uses a different set of resistors or capacitors to do what it's doing. So yeah, I think this being a completely passive EQ, like a Pultec, it's a passive EQ.
It's interesting. I wonder if people do this. I wonder if people actually figure out what their gear's doing. Because when you're talking to people about equipment, and I'm one of those people that talks about equipment, you're like, oh, I love the way this sounds. So we make this assumption that their 2.8 EQ sounds better than somebody else's 2.8 EQ.
Very true.
And it might be that one person's gear is just boosting 2.8, and the other one's is just doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Every EQ is different, but this one, passive EQs in general, whether it's this one or actually this is a passive EQ as well. Like I said, the electronics that allow you to do this frequency or that frequency sometimes dictate the shape and what it's doing. And I know that's happening on this one.
And people love passive EQ, and again, this would be a great explanation because with active EQs, it's sidechaining. It's taking a piece of the signal off, boosting it, and then folding it back into the signal, which inherently can mess with the phase relationship.
Right.
So that's when people say to me, oh, this sounds really EQ'd.
It's really kind of the sound of standard EQs is how much phase shift it has. Right. Cleaner EQs have less.
Well,
passive EQs have very little.
Passive take the whole signal and apply the EQ to it.
Yeah.
So we've done a little bit on this.
Manly, massive, passive. Yep. Once again, a unique EQ, although it's not as unique as this one, where everything about that is weird and special.
It's a little bit more detailed?
Yeah, I can get a lot more detailed. Once again, this is still a broad EQ. It's a one-band EQ. We got 4 controls on a one-band EQ, meaning almost no phase shifting. So I can do these huge boosts on this thing if necessary, and it doesn't get harsh, and it doesn't get weird and phasey, because quite honestly, it's one band of EQ, meaning if I go to, let's find one that matches here. If I go to this band, and I go 1.2 kilohertz, and let's say the bandwidth is there, and I boost it by 4 dB, or 4 clicks. I'll explain why that's not dB in just a second. And then I go over to this band, which also has a 1.2 right here, and I set it to the exact same settings. What would happen on a normal EQ?
Well, presumably it would get significantly louder.
Right, you'd add another 3 dB, right?
Yeah.
Because they're in series. A normal EQ, you've got band 1, band 2, band 3, and they go series. So if I EQ this frequency here and here, I've now EQ'd it twice. Not the case with this guy. Right now, this is just going into the same spot this is at because it's a single band. All the bands interact with each other. So the only way I'm going to get more volume now is to go above that. It's all additive. It's a single band with 4 controls.
Why would you have crossover points of frequencies then?
Once again, phase shifting. Making it really is a mastering EQ when they designed it, in the point that I can do huge boosts if necessary and not get phase shifting and sound like EQing. Like you said, it sounds really EQ'd. It doesn't really happen with this guy. One of the other things that's interactive is the gain and the bandwidth on these. If you look at the settings here, when I have that boosted all the way up with the bandwidth as high as it'll go, as tight as it'll go, and if I have that cranked up all the way, that's 20 dB of gain, which I'm not, in mastering, I'm never EQing by 20 dB. At the most, maybe 1 or 2 dB. With the bandwidth all the way as tight as it'll go, this will do 20 dB of boost. I didn't change the gain, I just changed the bandwidth. As low, as wide as it would go, it's now only 6 dB of boost.
Is it physically in your chain the way we see it?
It is if I do this.
And how do you... So what I'm saying is, Is this naturally? Does this represent a bit of a signal flow?
Absolutely not.
Oh, okay.
It's with mastering it's always different. There is no single setup. As preset as it can be, I have a setting on my digital patch bay here that loads up a preset that goes out of that computer through both converters over to here, runs through the input gains, stereo width. These are all my inserts, meaning push this guy and I got my Manley EQ. Push that guy and I have my Pendulum compressor. That one is the SPL EQ. And they are in series here, and I can flip 5 and 6 around. A couple other options as far as rearranging stuff, but basically this is all just here available to me. With a push of a button, I can put it into the signal path. With another one, I can reroute things.
I'm sure you're very conscious of, like, when I'm mixing, especially mixing on an SSL, for me it's EQ into compression. Because I boost something, and to get that spanky kind of aggressive SSLs, I push it back down. So I might boost, I don't know, 3K on something, and then I compress it very heavily. But of course, it's grabbing that 3K first, which doesn't just turn it down; it makes it go ka ka, and gives us that aggression. I'm assuming you're conscious of stuff like that, where you're boosting or go into compression.
This button here, which flips these two inserts. It's my Pendulum compressor and my SPL EQ. This thing has a sweet, really, really sweet top end. So that was one of the main reasons why we got this, for this unbelievably silky, beautiful top end. If I'm compressing it first, which without that button pushed in, it goes compressor, then EQ, I can flip that if I want to. And it makes 100% difference every time, depending on what I'm doing with this EQ. If I'm boosting the bass and then it hits the compressor secondarily, that bass is going to be causing a lot more compression than the rest of the song. Depending on certain aspects. But in mastering situations, I a lot of times will do the EQ before compression.
Now, the Weiss, I've seen these a few times. I hear these can get very surgical.
Yeah, basically I have incredibly broad colored EQ, somewhere in the middle, colored but controllable. And I can get pretty surgical with this, but not that surgical because of the way the bands interact. This guy being a digital EQ, it will do 650 is the tightest bandwidth, which is less than a single note. So I can go in and remove single notes with this guy, just so you can see. That's what that is.
Just a line.
Just a spike. Yeah, just a straight line on the graph there, and you widen it out. And the widest point on this guy takes up pretty much the entire bandwidth. So you can go from incredibly wide to incredibly not wide, and just remove single frequencies. I gotta admit that I've never had it that tight, you know what I mean?
Right.
But I can go in and do some pretty surgical stuff with this. It's a 7-band EQ. It will do MS, left, right, and any one of the bands can be either a high pass, low pass filter, shelving, high or low shelving, or a bell-shaped EQ, a parametric.
It's amazing.
And then it also has an option for dynamic EQ. For a long time, dynamic EQ, other than this one, meant basically multiband compression, where they call that a dynamic EQ. It lets you EQ. It's basically a parametric EQ with a threshold control. Where I use it is when I don't need de-essing, but there's a harsh note every now and then. I don't want it there all the time, right? But there's like the third chorus, they added a cymbal or something, and it's incredibly harsh, or something along those lines. I can go in and correct that, and then go back to the threshold control and now say I want to control it dynamically, and set the threshold to where it doesn't do any EQ until it gets to there. It plays that cymbal part, which causes that frequency band to get louder, and now it's going to compress it and dip it out. But it's only compressing the EQ bandwidth based on the EQ bandwidth. So it's reading the EQ bandwidth, compressing the EQ bandwidth, and basically taking it to the point of that corrective EQ. This one owns only downwards correctional, meaning that I can only like take things and effectively move them. I can boost it, but it's going to do the same thing. It's going to lower it when it hits that threshold. This has a really, really sweet top end and low end, which is where a lot of digital EQs used to lack. The low end would get boxy, and the high end would get distorted.
Yep.
And this doesn't do that. There are some plug-in EQs now. They're just as good as this are getting better. I still like having it in the rack, though, and having knobs, gain, frequency, bandwidth, instead of a mouse to control all that.
Yeah, tactile is nice, isn't it? Be able to reach for stuff. So what's interesting now, you've got this, you've got the Manley as your sort of center section, But you've also got the Crane song, which presumably is doing the same thing if you wanted to.
No. Two mastering console. Actually, I said this is my console before. It's actually these two together.
Two together. So how do you employ them together?
It's called a mastering console. Other people call it an insert switcher. Because basically what this is doing is my routing and audio control. There's two paths going on. There's my monitor path, and then there's the capture path. Everything starts over there on the source computer. When somebody gives me a mix, I'll load it into that computer. And it'll play out of there through my D to A, come into the console here. And basically what I'm talking about is the processing path. This audio is going through all the gear, coming over to my master system and being recorded. Certain points in the audio path, source point, output of the master, output of a reference, input of this, output of this, is all right here in my monitor controller. So unlike a mixing console where that's all put into one board and the center section or master section has your routing and control and monitor control and sourcing and stuff like that, in a mastering console, in a lot of cases, they're two separate things. So I have my process path and my monitor path. And this is probably the most important piece of gear in the room, is my monitor controller. You said before, you know, I'm a big fan of Manly, and I do have some Manly stuff here, and I do like it. They have a nice way of coloring things without going overboard on it. Crane Song is a company I'm a giant fan of. I've found that a lot of people either like the tone of it or not. To me, once again, being a mastering engineer, I'm looking for something that's clean unless I don't want it to be clean. His monitor controller, the cool little thing that it does that most of them don't, is gain matching or level matching. So I have 3 digital inputs here. My source, my reference, meaning if they give me a track that they like the sound of or the level of, I can load that in here, and that's my reference level. Or if I'm doing an album, as I'm working, I'll be, collecting the captured songs, and I'll be able to reference the stuff I've already mastered against the song I'm working on now. So source, master, and reference.
Great.
And then 3 analog inputs. This one is basically which one of these have I selected. So one of the first things I do is go there and say, which of my converters is going to work best for this song? This one does a bit of the 4-cell converter somehow adds a bit of space without, it's not like turning a stereo width knob or something like that, but it adds a spaciousness between the sounds and stuff. Where the Crane Song one literally sounds like the source. On the monitor controller, I can hear the input of the console versus the output of the console, or source, master, reference. And then through my digital patch bay, I can pretty much put anything in there I want as well. So if we're going to listen to a CD, I can send that to my reference if I wanted to. So real quick, what I was talking about with the level matching with this thing, let's say the other thing is this stepped knob. Like I said, this is one of the most important things in here because it's a calibrated room. This is where my monitor gain usually is for most modern recordings. And I know that when I have this level here, a certain loudness is coming out of these speakers when it's correct. So when I'm working here, there's my mix, and the master is considerably louder. So what I can do is hit this guy as I'm working and gain him up. And basically match the levels as I'm working. What that lets me do is hear the master at the same level as the source. And in a lot of cases, what you're doing in mastering is trying to get that level up without screwing up their mix. There's other monitor controls that do the level matching, but not as easy as that. Hit the button, hit it again, level match it, hit it again, goes back to monitor control. And it's that simple. If you're doing surround sound, you can hit one button and turn this all into surround sound. It takes a couple more input-output boxes. I have one for stereo. I think it takes 3 of them to do surround sound. And it also does polarity, mono, dimming. Cool thing that you don't see on any other piece of equipment is a 16-bit truncation on the input. And what that does is allows me to hear dither, truly hear it, because it takes the input all the way to the output and makes it 16-bit.
Do you hear that much difference?
You'd be surprised. Sometimes no. It really depends on the music. Like something that's super loud, like a hip-hop track that's just loud the whole time, you're not really going to hear much difference. It's when things dip down into the quiet areas. Like that song we were just listening to, that just guitar strumming out notes, boom, 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 and a slow drum beat. There's so much space and openness there. That's what really gets messed up when you're truncating things. Is it takes away the depth and space. The quiet parts.
Dave Jordan always used to say to me it was reverb trails for him.
Yeah. No,
like hearing the decay on something.
I listen to the depth. Like when I hit that, I hear the depth go boom. When I'm working, I'm listening in between sounds, especially on the dynamics processing. With EQ, I'm more listening to the full sound. Compression, I'm listening, like, let's say, here's the vocal, and here's a guitar, and here's a guitar. I'm listening to the space in between those, because if I'm compressing, I'm bringing that up. Technically, you're bringing down the loud parts to bring up the quiet.
Sure.
But those quiet areas are where the details lie in music. It's the stuff that's not right in your face a lot of times, at least on my side of the process. It's all about the details and bringing out those details, and they exist in between and below the loud stuff.
That really sounds like the art of listening to me.
Yeah.
I see an antelope down there.
Yeah. Once again, the room, like a lot of mastering studios these days, is controlled by a central master clock. This box, the 10MX, is an atomic clock. This thing can be used. It has word clock outputs. If we only needed one word clock to control the whole room, all you really need is this now. Because it has word clock outputs, and I can have it run at any sample rate from 32, right? 32 kilohertz to 768 kilohertz. Right now, the way that we're using it is this atomic clock is sent to this Trinity box, which gives me 3 different sample rates. My master sample rate for my Sadie system, my source sample rate for WaveLab over there, and the center one is any digital processors. My TC Electronics System 6000, it has a word clock input. So since that TC6000 might be put in before my converter, or it might be put in after my converter, I have that on a separate word clock because a lot of times this thing will look like this. The source they give me will be 44K, but I almost always capture at 96K regardless of the source. In a mastering room where you have all these different pieces of gear that you have to tie together, something like this is pretty much necessary or invaluable.
Yep.
In a larger studio like this, the 3 sample rate thing is really, really handy. I have 2 converters. This is a D to A, a 4-cell D to A converter. And then I have a Crane Song head, which is both a D to A converter and an A to D converter and a harmonics processor.
All of this here.
Yeah, these 3 knobs here, those 3 knobs are incredibly powerful. There's a triode harmonic, which tends to add detail to the bass and sometimes can boost level. Mm-hmm. A pentode harmonics, which those are 2 different types of tubes, by the way. Pentodes tend to add harmonic distortion to the mid-range and the high range, and it adds detail and depth to things while also giving you some level. And then there's a knob labeled tape. When you record a tape, there's certain EQ things that go on in the recording, and then there's harmonics added, and there's a bit of a tape compression thing that happens. Yeah, yep. And this simulates, it's all digital, but it simulates that as well. Before you cringe when I say all that analog harmonics is digital, it does it in a way that absolutely does not sound digital. And one of the cool things as well, just talking about the harmonics processing here, if I want to use this as just a processing box, I don't have to use the converters. I can hit a knob here and have it go digital in, digital out. And one of the reasons why this sounds so natural and sounds like the harmonics that would come out of an analog piece of gear is because it isn't processing the signal. Signal comes in, hits the output, and much like a compressor, sends it out to a secondary processing algorithm that creates the distortion and then mixes that into the original. So it's not taking your signal and processing it into distortion. It takes the signal and analyzes it and creates the harmonic distortion built on that and kind of mixes it in a parallel situation. So the only thing that's distorted is the distortion. First it hits my D to A's, and on the console here, I have a selection right here of that D to A coming into the console, this D to A coming into the console, and they have a different sound, or an auxiliary input, which is an analog input I have on the ground. I have a nice turntable back there. Sometimes I do vinyl transfers to digital for older stuff that people want to save.
So what's the turntable?
The turntable is made by a company called Shinola. And
that's a nice name.
Well, what they do is actually
Shinola,
they take merchandise or products from companies and kind of give it a different look. And they're belt driven. So rather than a motor turning the table, there's a little motor over here and a belt that turns the table.
Is there a difference?
The belt-driven ones seem to be, if you're looking for accuracy, they tend to be cleaner. And because the motor isn't on the table itself, it's not going to be vibrating and that kind of a thing.
All right, well, this is fun. We can do this all day.
Yeah, we could probably sit here another 3 hours.
Yes, exactly. So anybody that got to the end here, please leave a bunch of comments and questions below, as ever. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. We'll definitely do more with Warren. Warren, thank you, Warren.
Thank you, Warren. Nice to meet you, Warren.
Okay, well. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. We'll see you again soon.
Cheers.